Imagine a man walking alone down a quiet street. Not just today, not just this evening, but always. No calls, no messages. No one waiting for him at the end of the road. He is not part of anyone's plans, not included in anyone's memories. To the world, he is invisible. Now, ask yourself, who is he? A man to be pitied? A man to be feared? Or perhaps a man to be admired? We live in a world where friendships define us, where being surrounded by others is seen as a measure of success, of happiness, of worth. A man without friends is an anomaly, a question that society struggles to answer. Did he push people away, or did they leave him behind? Is he lonely, or is he at peace in his own company? Tonight we step into his world, the world of a man who walks alone, a world that is silent yet filled with thought, empty yet full of meaning, a world that many misunderstand, because sometimes the greatest strength is not found in the crowd, but in the quiet defiance of a man who chooses solitude over a life of shallow connections. There is a profound difference between solitude and loneliness, though many fail to see it. Solitude is a choice, a deliberate retreat into one's own thoughts, while loneliness is an affliction, a feeling of being unwanted or disconnected. A man who walks alone by choice is not necessarily a man who suffers. He may have discovered a certain peace in the quiet, a rare kind of clarity that comes only when the noise of the world fades. But a man who is forced into loneliness, abandoned by those he once held dear, or cast aside by a world that does not understand him, experiences something altogether different. Solitude is a state of being, one that can be empowering, even liberating. It allows for introspection, for deep thinking without the interference of others. Some of the greatest minds in history have embraced solitude, finding within it the space to create, to ponder, to grow. A man who chooses to be alone can wield solitude like a tool, using it to carve out a life of meaning, purpose, and deep understanding. He answers to no one, depends on no one, and in doing so he discovers a sense of self that is unshaken by the opinions of others. Loneliness, on the other hand, is not a choice. It creeps in uninvited, settling in the corners of the mind like an unwanted guest. It is the absence of connection, the gnawing feeling of being unseen, unheard. A man who is lonely does not revel in his own company. He yearns for another voice, another presence, to remind him that he exists in the eyes of the world. Loneliness is not simply the lack of people, it is the lack of warmth, of understanding, it is standing in a crowded room and feeling invisible, walking through life and leaving no footprints. The distinction between solitude and loneliness is not always clear. A man may choose solitude today and find himself lonely tomorrow. What begins as a preference for quiet can slowly turn into an unbearable silence. Time stretches in the absence of companionship, and what once felt like freedom can begin to feel like a prison. The human heart, no matter how strong, was not built to exist in complete isolation. Even the most independent man, the one who claims he needs no one, will at some point feel the weight of being alone. Some men embrace solitude despite this risk, preferring the certainty of their own company over the uncertainty of human connection. Perhaps they've been betrayed one too many times, or perhaps they've simply seen the world for what it is, filled with fleeting relationships, empty promises, and the inevitable pain of loss. In solitude, there is no betrayal, no disappointment. There is only the self, and for some, that is enough. The question remains, does a man choose solitude, or does solitude choose him? The answer is never simple. It is a line that shifts, blurs, and sometimes disappears altogether. A man with no friends is often seen as an anomaly, a deviation from the norm. Society thrives on connection, on the intricate web of relationships that bind people together. From childhood, we are taught that friendships are essential, that they define our worth, that a life without them is a life unfulfilled. A man who walks alone disrupts this narrative, forcing people to question what they have always believed. They look at him with curiosity, with suspicion, sometimes even with pity, because he exists outside the expected pattern. There is an unspoken rule that one must belong, that solitude is unnatural unless it is temporary. When people encounter a man with no friends, their minds search for an explanation. They wonder if he is broken, if he is bitter, if he has been cast out for reasons unknown. They assume that he must be lonely. For why else would someone live without companionship? It rarely occurs to them that he might have chosen this path, that he might have found something in solitude that they cannot understand. Some see him as a failure, as someone who could not integrate, who is unable to form lasting connections. They believe that his lack of friends is proof of something lacking within him. Perhaps he is too difficult, too strange, too withdrawn. There is a tendency to measure a man's worth by the company he keeps, to judge him not by his character but by his relationships. And so, a man without friends is often seen as someone who has lost something essential, a man who is incomplete. Others see him as a threat, a question mark in a world that prefers certainty. A man without attachments is unpredictable, untethered, and this unsettles people. He does not rely on others, does not seek approval, does not fit into the usual categories. This makes him harder to control, harder to understand. Society finds comfort in groups, in shared beliefs and collective thinking. A man who walks alone is a reminder that one can exist outside of this structure, and that idea is unsettling. Then there are those who romanticize him, who see mystery in his solitude. They imagine him as a thinker, a wanderer, someone who has stepped away from the trivialities of social life to pursue something deeper. They see him as wise, as self-sufficient, as someone who has found strength where others might have found suffering. But even this is an assumption, a way of making sense of something that does not fit into conventional understanding. The truth is, a man with no friends is neither hero nor villain, neither victim nor victor. He simply is. And yet society will always seek to define him, to place him into a category that makes sense. Because to accept that a man can walk alone, without sorrow, without regret, is to challenge the very fabric of human connection. And that is something many are unwilling to do. The mind of a man with no friends is a place of unbroken conversation, a vast and private landscape where thoughts roam unchecked. Without the distraction of companionship, he is left to contend with himself, to listen to his own voice in the absence of others. Some might see this as a gift, an opportunity for deep introspection, a chance to understand oneself without external influence. Others might see it as a curse, an endless cycle of thoughts without an outlet, a dialogue that has no response. Without friends, there is no one to reflect his thoughts back to him, no one to validate his ideas or challenge them. He becomes his own audience, his own critic, his own confidant. There is no laughter shared across a table, no comforting words in times of doubt. Every triumph is celebrated in silence, every sorrow borne alone. Over time, his internal dialogue shapes the way he sees the world, for there is no outside perspective to soften its edges. Thoughts that might have once been fleeting become rooted, unquestioned, because there is no one there to offer an alternative. Two take on a different weight. When friendships exist, the past is shared, retold, and reshaped through conversation. A joke is remembered not just for its humor, but for the way it made others laugh. A struggle is recalled not only for its hardship, but for the comfort that followed. Without friends, memories are solitary things. They are revisited alone, unchallenged and unspoken. There is no one to remind him of the good times when the bad ones overshadow them. No one to say, "Do you remember when?" The past becomes a collection of moments locked away, seen only through his own eyes, never given new life through the voices of others. Doubt can take root easily in such a mind. Without reassurance, without the simple affirmations that friendships provide, he may question himself more deeply than others do. Did he make the right choices? Is he who he believes himself to be? Without the sounding board of conversation, self-perception can become unstable. A small mistake might loom larger than it should. A fleeting insecurity might grow into something more. The absence of feedback, of kindness, of gentle reminders that one is enough, leaves room for shadows to grow where light might have been. But there is also a kind of power in this solitude. A man who has only himself to rely on learns to trust his own instincts. He does not seek validation, nor does he shape himself to fit the expectations of others. His thoughts are his own, unfiltered, uninfluenced. He knows himself in a way that few do. for he has spent countless hours in his own company. He does not lose himself in the noise of the crowd, does not seek to be anything other than what he is. There is a clarity that comes with this, a sharpness of mind that is both a shield and a weight, a freedom and a burden. A life without friendship is a life without reflection. In the presence of others, a man sees himself more clearly. He hears his own laughter in their voices, feels the warmth of his existence in their presence. A friend is a mirror, offering a reflection not just of appearance but of identity, of meaning, of belonging. Without these mirrors, a man begins to fade, not in body but in spirit. He becomes an outline of himself, a shape without definition, a presence without confirmation. There is a weight to being unseen. It is not simply the absence of conversation or companionship, but the slow erosion of acknowledgement. When no one calls your name, you begin to wonder if it was ever meant to be spoken. When no one asks how you are, the answer becomes irrelevant. The world moves forward, and a man without friends remains still, watching life unfold without him. He exists, but he is not included. He is present, but he is not part of anything beyond himself. In the absence of friendship, small joys lose their color. Laughter, when shared, multiplies. It bounces between people, growing larger with each voice that joins in. But alone, it is brief, fading almost as soon as it begins. Success, when unacknowledged, feels hollow. A milestone reached with no one to witness it is like a firework in an empty sky, bright for a moment, but quickly swallowed by the dark. Even sorrow, heavy as it is, feels lighter when carried together. But when there is no one to share the burden, it settles deep, unmoving, untouched by the comfort of another. Time itself stretches differently in solitude. A conversation can make an hour feel like a moment, while silence can make a moment feel like an hour. Days blend into one another when there is no one to mark them, no shared experiences to define them. The passing of time is measured not in events, but in the changing of the seasons, in the quiet rhythm of existence. There is no one to say, "Do you remember when?" And so memories remain locked in a single perspective, untouched by the warmth of shared recollection. There is a certain strength in enduring this solitude. A man without friends must find meaning within himself. He cannot rely on others to remind him of his worth, to lift his spirits when they waver. He must be his own source of comfort, his own source of motivation. Some would call this strength admirable, a kind of resilience forged in silence. Others would call it tragic, a life deprived of the simple joys that come from being known, from being seen. Whether this solitude is chosen or forced, the cost remains. Without friendships, a man may never truly know how he appears in the eyes of the world. He may live a life of quiet dignity, of self-sufficiency, of deep introspection, but he will always be missing something, a presence beyond his own, a voice that is not his, a reminder that he exists not just for himself, but in the hearts and minds of others. A man without friends is often left to wonder whether he shaped his fate or if fate shaped him. Did he choose to walk alone, or was he pushed onto this path by forces beyond his control? Some find solace in isolation, embracing the quiet, the independence, the certainty of self-reliance. Others find themselves trapped in it, yearning for connection but unable to grasp it. The line between choice and circumstance is not always clear. Sometimes what begins as preference turns into habit, and what starts as self-preservation becomes a prison. For some, solitude is a conscious decision. Perhaps he has seen the fleeting nature of human relationships, the betrayals, the disappointments. He may have once extended his hand only to find it left hanging in the air, unanswered. He may have learned through experience that trust can be fragile, that friendships can fade, that people leave. And so, rather than endure the pain of loss, he chooses absence from the start. In solitude, he controls the narrative. He is not abandoned because he does not seek attachment. He does not lose anyone because he never lets them close. It is not loneliness, he tells himself, but liberation. He is beholden to no one, dependent on nothing but his own mind, his own will. For others, solitude is not a choice but a consequence. It is the result of misunderstanding, of being different in ways the world does not accept. Some are too quiet, too reserved, too distant for friendships to form naturally. Others are too intense, too complex, too unwilling to fit into the social mold. Over time, people drift away, not out of cruelty, but because they do not know how to stay. The man left behind may not have intended to be alone, but he finds himself there nonetheless, wondering at what point the world stopped reaching for him. There is also the gradual nature of isolation, a slow erosion rather than a sudden departure. Perhaps he once had friends, but life took them in different directions. Responsibilities grew, priorities shifted, and suddenly the people he once knew became strangers. Conversations became rare, then non-existent. One day he looks around and realizes that no one remains. He did not push them away, nor did they abandon him with intent. It simply happened, as things do when left unattended, and now he must decide whether to rebuild those connections or accept the silence. Whether chosen or imposed, solitude changes a man. He learns to think differently, to navigate life without the support of others. He may grow stronger, more self-sufficient, or he may grow bitter, resentful of the world that left him behind. He may take pride in his independence, or he may ache for the warmth of voices that never call his name. The question of whether he chose this life or whether it was chosen for him lingers, unanswered. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in the quiet spaces, where choice and fate intertwine. A man with no friends is not simply a shadow in the background of society. He is a reflection of something deeper, something that unsettles and intrigues us. He stands as proof that life can exist beyond the constant hum of companionship, that solitude can be both a refuge and a test. Some may see his existence as a tragedy, others as a triumph. But in truth, he is neither hero nor victim. He is simply a man who walks a different path, one that few dare to tread. Whether he chose this life or whether it was chosen for him remains an open question, one that perhaps even he cannot answer. What is certain, however, is that solitude shapes a person in ways that are both profound and irreversible. It grants clarity but demands resilience, offers freedom but exacts a cost. And yet, despite what the world may think, a man without friends is not always a man without purpose. Sometimes he is simply a man who has learned to find meaning in his own company. And so, as you leave here tonight, I ask you to consider this. Is a life without friends truly empty, or is it just different? The answer may not be as simple as we once thought. Good luck in your own journey, whether surrounded by many or walking alone, and thank you for listening.